conversations do we have as a school versus what types of conversations do we have as a district. If you were able to make it out to the pastries with the principal, we are dedicated to alliteration here. You got to learn all about some of the new things happening at the school, new classes that are taking place, what's going on with arrival and dismissal, all of the things going on with 4th grade this year, and what it means to have all grade levels on our campus. This conversation is different because the gathering place not only represents a school, but it also is a movement in education to reshift the conversation of what matters in schools. I was at an event the last couple of days. There was an event for district leaders across the whole city. And those types of events were more common before COVID. But in the last couple of years, there actually hasn't been a ton of those opportunities to come together. And I have to, I hate to start on a down note, but it was tragic listening to the way that leaders of so many other school systems think and talk about kids. The entire conversation that the TEA sponsored this event that was been with superintendents and district leaders was exclusively about how do you get what they call bubble kids, if you've heard this phrase before, to do better on a standardized test. If you don't know the phrase bubble child, congratulations, welcome to TGP. However, in most schools, the definition of a bubble child is a child that failed the state test the year before, but just barely, and therefore is most likely to pass the state test next year. And you get extra brownie points as a school if you get a kid that almost passed the pass. And so most school systems operate with the idea of how do we put all of our energy into our bubble kids so that we look the best. Other terms that you hear are that way you don't have to worry so much about your high kids or your low kids. That's language that is common practice amongst district and school leaders, not just here in San Antonio, but across the country. And so when we talk about the gathering place as a movement about thinking about kids and education differently, that is what we are not doing. That is what we are wanting to change. And that is the purpose of the gathering place as a district, is to not only run beautiful schools that approach from a wildly different ideology, but also to then use that as a proof point to influence and change the narrative in other schools. Already last week, one of the leading funding groups that oversees and supports teacher training programs across our city, both working with all universities and alternative certification programs, now has a liaison with the gathering place to begin adapting how all teacher certification programs in the city work to better model specifically how we approach work around social justice and equity and how we coach teachers. That means the entire arc of the city in teacher training is already beginning to change because of the work that our staff and our caregivers and our kids are doing. That's the whole point, and a huge celebration. And so, all of that to say, what is the problem? Yes, thank you. I need to work on my cadences. So anyway, today we're going to dive into what learning looks like in the gathering place. There are bits and pieces here that you have probably heard before, and then there's other pieces that we're going to dive a lot deeper than we have in the past. And today, we have different parts of our model. Today is very specifically about what are we talking about when we talk about learning. When you read our website, when you look at class tag posts, when you listen to us talk, you will hear phrases like project-based learning, authentic learning, deeper learning. And so we wanted to start with what does learning mean? And this is an interesting question because it's a word that I'm sure everyone here would identify as knowing. However, I guarantee you that all of us, if they're asked to define it, would have very different answers. And usually when that happens, that means that it's a moment to pause and reflect. So where we're going to start, we're going to get to know some of the people at our table, if you don't already. We're going to kick off with a little bit of chat, what us educators call a turn and talk, which is, what is the difference between remembering and learning? Two words that most of us here would identify as knowing, but what's the difference between the two? And once you discuss that question, we're going to follow up with which happens in most schools, And is one more valuable than you? So take about 2 minutes, discuss these 3 questions with the people at your table. To share, like that, it's a pivot. I would love to hear, what was something that you heard at your table that stood out to you? Maybe it says to you about the difference between remembering and learning. Somebody just share out.
Learning is more intuitive. It gives picture.
Wonderful. Who else?
I said remembering is more memorization, like just having the information in your head, whereas learning is getting generalized information out of your mind.
Generalize versus just having the information in your head. What else?
Talk about process, like learning to think about a process and practice and instilling skills.
Yeah.
Regurgitation.
Yeah, there's this sense of like remembering is this very static thing where like if I told you I'm thinking of a number in my head, it's 57, and then I'd say remember that at the end of this conversation, you're just holding on to that number. It doesn't have any other connections to anything else. Who else?
She said it's like your ability to apply what you remember.
To apply something. Ah, fascinating. Apply, process, connect. These are words associated with remembering versus holding on to. I heard regurgitating is more connected to remembering. What happens in most schools? When you picture like a traditional school, a kid at a desk, what's happening most of the time? Remembering, right? I had a math teacher that used to tell me, don't ask why, just invert and multiply. And teaching me how to divide fractions. Some things that rhyme aren't goods. There's a lesson that needs to be taught there. And is one more valuable than the other? Were you able to put like a value metric to it? Say what? Learning more valuable? Depends on the situation. I'm glad that my dentist remembers which tools to use. Yes, learning has value. Who
I
else?
was going to say, I think they need each other.
They need each other. Yes. And the reason, though, that school is so much more remembering-based, it's test-based. It's much easier to see if you remember something. If I tell you the number I'm thinking in my head is 57, at the end of here, as you're leaving, if I go, what number was it? You either are going to say 57 and be right, or something other than 57 and be wrong. That's very easy. However, if the purpose of this entire session was about how to instill emotion through art or through painting, it would be very difficult to walk out of here and say who learned it and who didn't. But this is the backdrop of an understanding education. There's an amazing study that actually came out like 100 years ago that is called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Has anyone here heard of that? Or maybe you have and you forgot. The entire point of this is when we are talking about remembering, which is different than meaning making and learning, then if we do not have a deep personal connection to the information, we forget 66% of things that we experience or are told after just one day, 75% after a week, and then as the name implies, it is an ongoing curve of less and less and less. And this kind of makes sense, right? If you think about non-important information that entered into your brain a week ago, like maybe what somebody was wearing, or what type of car was in front of you on the way to work, or somebody's phone number that you had to call, those are the types of things that we forget very quickly. And this shows up in the way that we think about school. There was a beautiful study done where they took a group of high school students, I think it was over 1,000 high school students, who scored an A on a final exam in the class they were in. So we would say they did well, right? That's the traditional benchmark of doing well. They did it, they passed the class, they learned the thing. But we are misusing the word learning there. They didn't learn the thing. They remembered the thing because when they came back for the exact same exam 3 months later, and they didn't get told that they were going to take the exam again. They didn't get a chance to go build new flashcards or pull them out from a box. They just were given the same exam, 80% fail. What did we just do? What was the purpose of all of that time? What was the purpose of all of that energy and money that went into training people to get the kids to make the A? If then they just failed the test after 3 months. And I'm sure many of us, if we went through a public school setting or other settings possibly, have experiences of cramming for a test that you don't care about for a bunch of information that you don't remember or use. And that's not to say, to what we said earlier, there aren't things that are important to remember. However, the remembering is the low bar. Yes, there are certain things you need to remember, but the purpose of school should be so much more than that. There's a picture on this slide that's not rendering. Try this again. There it is. So, I'm gonna dust off a little bit of education grad school here, so a few terms that are gonna be very interesting. This is all about some of the research and science behind learning. Has anyone heard of Bloom's taxonomy before? Is this a familiar phrase? Some, most not. This is something that you get taught in education school a lot, which actually is not super important in your first few months of teaching, because then you're just like, what do I do? But then after a few years, suddenly this becomes really important. Bloom's taxonomy is work that's been done out of Harvard Graduate School, and it actually started in the 1960s by someone whose last name is Bloom. No, remember his first name, John. Anyways, Bloom's taxonomy talks about the different stages of learning. And the different stages of learning increase in complexity. The easiest thing to do is to remember something. I can tell you the number 57, you can tell it back to me. You remembered something. That's not bad, but it's also not hard. Understanding something is more complex. If we are diving into a given topic, understanding something is more complex than remembering it. The difference is that you can explain it, you can identify it. Then you get into applying. This is what I heard from a few people over here. It's not just a matter of remembering something, now you can actually apply it. If we are talking about, for example, architecture, which was an example that was brought up, remembering certain angles and dimensions is one thing. Being able to identify a right angle is a little bit more complex than just being able to say a right angle is 90 degrees. But now being able to apply it to build something that is a square and therefore using right angles is even more complex and represents a deeper understanding. When we talk about deeper learning, we're talking about going up this pyramid. Even more complex than applying is analyzing. Ooh, now you have to be put in different situations and identify where are there right angles and where aren't there right angles, and how can I tell, and what am I looking at to identify whether or not they are. Then you get into evaluating. This starts to be not just even is it a right angle, but was the right angle the right thing to use in the first place? And then you can actually critique and argue and say, actually, I don't think we should have used the right angle. We should have used a more obtuse angle to allow more sunlight into this structure. Now we're really using this knowledge. And then, of course, the highest level of any content when it comes to learning is then the ability to create. And unfortunately, almost everything that happens in most schools is here. Maybe if the class is good, as a treat, you get to do something where you apply with it as like a fun bonus thing after the unit. Because it's very hard to test this. It's very hard to assess this. And unfortunately, because we live in a test-driven culture, if you can't measure it, we don't care. But that is not good for humanity, and it's not good for kids. There's another picture. This is going to be a trend. Here we are. There's also a huge problem that happens in education, which is, I'm going to go back a slide. Nope, wrong way. We think that you have to learn in this order. We think you have to remember all the boring stuff, to then understand it, to then apply it, to evaluate, analyze it, to then create with it. And so then if kids aren't doing this, which by the way, this is really boring if you don't get why you're doing it. Whatever professions, skills, trades people in this room have, if you didn't actually know any of the things you know and people were just telling you to memorize facts about it, that would not be fun. That would not be enjoyable. You probably wouldn't do it. And so one of the huge things we get wrong is we think, oh, well, we can't do this stuff because kids have to do this first. that is like a fundamental belief that exists in almost all schools, and it is not only wrong from an ideological standpoint, but also from a research standpoint. Because actually the domain that you learn best in is the domain of creating. The domain you learn best in is exploring, is having fun with something, with tinkering with something, and then you begin to see how things work. And teachers are facilitators that then help make meaning from those experiences. And when done well, you remember. There's a few other names that are good to know. In part because this is not just like Ryan's idea about education, right? This is not Ryan and Asha coming up with theories. This is like 60 plus years of research that exists. And I will also point out that in the education research field from the 1920s to the 1960s, the things that were actually paid and published oftentimes, you will notice, are white men. There is work that's been done in communities all across our country that did not make it into research books, but that also absolutely reinforce and support these same ideals and beliefs. And that is important to understand that from lots of different cultures and backgrounds, the same conclusions about meaningful learning and child raising can be drawn. John Dewey and Lee Vygotsky identify a few important things, the most of which being that the more connections you have to something, the more deeply you understand it. Using the term architecture again, there are things related to architecture that I started to discuss. Those of you that know architecture would get a lot more meaning out of than those of you who don't. I know nothing about auto mechanics, so if you started talking to me about auto mechanics, I would appreciate your time, but I would also have no idea what you're talking about. And therefore, I would not make connections. Whereas somebody that knows a lot about auto mechanics, that then engages in an interesting conversation, is making all of these connections. And this should be relatable. I'm sure many of you have had people talk to you about things that you don't know anything about. It's not a particularly fruitful conversation. You don't walk away with like loads of insights that you didn't have before. But then you've also had really rich conversations with someone about something you know a lot about. Those are the conversations that are transformative. They're the ones that you walk away from better. They're the ones you walk away from knowing more. And that is not just something that we have all experienced. It is completely research-based behind John Dewey and Lee Vygotsky's work. When there are skills you consider yourself great at, how many connections do you have to those? Think about the things that you consider yourself to be good at. You probably have lots of experience and practice and connections to those. Now, how does that manifest in schools? Well, in schools, you typically just work through different class periods on random and isolated topics that aren't connected to actual practice. And so you're not making connections to your life and lived experience because you're not using time at school to have those experiences. You're just learning about them in a textbook or in a worksheet. I also want to emphasize which skills matter. Because when we think about school, a lot of times we think about like remembering that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell or something like that. And not, once again, if you are in medical research, that is good to know. I hope you do know that. I'm sure that we all have popularized things in the fact that some people know that. But when you think about, everyone here has different skills and traits. But things that are absolutely universally true in almost all walks of life are things like knowing how to resolve conflict well. How many times have you been trying to do something where conflict with another person slowed you down or made that work harder? And the better we are at knowing how to resolve that conflict, the better we're going to be at not only accomplishing our goals, but also enjoying the process. Think about event planning and all of the different ways that keeping up with lots of different things at the same time matters in our lives. Think about being able to use humor to help people. We as humans live on connection, and being able to inspire and help people do hard things and use humor to do that, that matters in this world. Think about being able to teach yourself something. How many times has your success in something been dependent on your ability to teach yourself? And what are all of the different skills you're using to do that? Creating delicious food. This is a huge part of our lives. It matters. making a room look beautiful, writing well, making friends. Not one of these things shows up on a standardized test. Not one of these things is focused on in school because it's not on a standardized test. The 2 days that I just spent in a room with a flickering fluorescent bulb with a bunch of district superintendents and school leaders from across the city, none of this came up. This is not what we're talking about in education, and yet it's what our kids need. Albert Bandera is another researcher that did a lot of work and discovered that the single fastest catalyst for learning is talking with other people. We are social creatures. We do not learn in isolation. And think about this in your own lives. If you are struggling with something, work, personal, whatever it is, you usually go talk to people about it. Sometimes it's just venting. Sometimes it's actually looking for problem-solving help. Sometimes it's just looking for affirmation that you're not the one that's in the wrong. Whatever it is, you go and you talk to people about it. We make meaning by discussing things with other people. And yet, the hallmark of an excellent classroom in most schools is a silent. A silent. In most schools, the idea of a great classroom is one where all the kids are quiet. When Asha and I were designing and planning the gathering place, many of you know, we've shared our stories, that we had created a project-based curriculum that then got used by schools all around the country. We had about 10,000 kids using our program across 8 states, and it was our job to train all of the teachers in all of those states on how to use the curriculum. We were in over 150 schools in 2 years. Almost every one of them, when we would get a tour of the school, the principal would walk us in to a classroom that was completely silent and just be so proud. Look how much control we have over these children. They are all silent. You know they don't want to be, but they are because we are in power. And that was like a legitimate pride. And most people that we would be with would be like, right? Because that is the image we think of as a great classroom. But I promise you, no learning is happening. Unless maybe it's just because we're so caught up in beautiful books that we're all reading. Right? Which that's true. That's beautiful. That happens. Yeah, sometimes. But most of the time, if we're learning, it's loud and it's noisy. And that's not just, once again, Ryan and Asha talking about learning. There's mounds of research behind this. But it's hard to test, so we don't do it. More images. Here we go. An amazing research that just came out. I nerd out on the neurology of this last month, where they had a group of experts across different professions engage with kids on a specific topic. So this could be how to make something, how to build something, understanding the main idea of a story. It ranged. And then the experts gauged how well does this child understand this concept, which in theory would be a pretty reliable measure of where a kid's at. And then they took the same group of kids, they gave them a multiple choice test about the content, and then they gave the kids an MRI while discussing the content. And the MRI was statistically significantly better at being able to tell and correlate with what experts said than the multiple choice test. Because the MRI showed that the more a kid understood it, the more parts of the brain were lighting up, the more connections that they had made. And so the research behind this idea that the more connections you're making to something, the better you know it, was validated by experts and measured in an MRI. However, kids that experts and MRI said were awesome at something also failed tests about it. And kids that experts and MRI showed didn't actually understand something, but could remember things well, did great on the test. Tests don't correlate with how well you know something. We understand this even through the very core neurology. There's a phrase that people in neurology use that's neurons that fire together, wire together. The more connections you make in your brain, the more you understand something. There's another image. And we're going to pivot to PBL. This is sort of the backdrop of learning. But there's a final piece here that's really important, because art and creating are not the same thing. There's lots of creative work that happens in non-artistic areas. However, the overlap of art and creating is very strong. It is essential to communicating our shared existence. People love art from all cultures and backgrounds. The University of Berkeley showed that regular participation in the arts reduces the risk of brain disease. We know this because art activates more connections in your brain than any other activity because it's cognitive freedom. The Research Center for Art and Culture found people who have regularly practiced the arts suffer less loneliness, anxiety, and depression, and are twice as likely to volunteer, which is fascinating correlation. And people that practice the arts identify as empathetic. More connections means deeper learning. We tend to not focus on drawing connections between jobs and school because the purpose of being human is not just to make money. The purpose of being human is not just to feed into capitalism. It is not just to be a worker. There's much more to being human. But for many people, that is still a part of living in this world. The World Economic Forum every year surveys leaders in lots of different industries to identify what are the most important skills to be successful in industries around the world. This was the list in 2015. This is the list in 2020. I'm not going to read that, I'm just going to give people a second to read that. And then I'm curious, as you're reading it, is there anything on here that's surprising to you? Feel free to popcorn out and share. School. Maybe those things are correlates. What else is surprising?
Cognitive flexibility.
Cognitive flexibility.
Because this is what you're learning. They want more think outside the box.
Yeah, so many people who manage other people name one of their biggest frustrations that, oh my gosh, this person needs to be told exactly what to do in order to do it. But that, once again, I wonder if that's because for 13 years, your definition of success in school is being able to do what you got told to do.
I think it's interesting that quality control is on the right side and emotional intelligence is on the left. Like, quality control, in a sense, it replaced emotional intelligence. Most of these are the same on both lists except that one.
Quality control went down, emotional intelligence went up, and there's a very specific reason for that. What is that reason? Bossing people around doesn't really work. That is absolutely true. And as technology serves as a greater mechanism of quality control in many industries, human quality control becomes less important. And instead, knowing how to inspire and motivate people, knowing how to get people to work together becomes more important. What does that tell you about school? When you picture a traditional classroom, how much of this is happening? None of it. I mean, in a lot of spaces. And don't get me wrong, there are teachers that close their door in other schools and do what they know is best for their kids. There is magic happening in schools all across the city. But it is against the grain. It is despite expectations. Now, what if these became the expectations? What would change in our world? Well, what a great question. That brings us to, what does that look like? Well, it's project-based learning. Specifically, project-based learning is not just another way to accomplish the same goals. Project-based learning not only mirrors real and meaningful work, it is real and meaningful work. Kids get told for 13 years, trust me, I know this doesn't make sense now, but you'll need it later. One, it usually doesn't. And two, kids are capable and worthy of engaging in meaningful work now. They don't need to wait until they're 20. Can you do things when you're 20 that you can't do when you're 5? Sure. And that doesn't mean that the work of childhood doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that kids can't engage in real and authentic work. Now, for the people that like to play devil's advocate, project-based learning classes and environments tend to result in better AP test scores, tend to result in better science test scores, tend to support literacy. I have an end slide, I'm going to share this slide in class tag, and the end slide has all the resources linked here so you can go dive deeper into them. Like, for the skeptics at heart, there is research showing that project-based learning supports in these areas. However, that's not the point. That's I guess, a happy correlation at best. What really matters here, one, there's an entire piece of literature that came out relatively recently that focused in on a meta-analysis of research related to critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and self-directed learning, you know, the teacher self. And in each one of these studies, project-based learning was the most effective format of increasing those skills. Additional pieces of research. Go. The Hechinger report had an amazing piece that came out a couple of years ago, 1 year ago, that showed 4 new studies that were over multiple years showing that project-based learning resulted in the most meaningful learning of any methodology of teaching. This is a chart that we use with our teachers. Project-based learning is a way of learning. There's a phrase that we use a lot called a dessert project. A dessert project is, we're going to do this whole chapter in a textbook, and then when we're done, we're going to make a diorama about this whole chapter we spent a month doing in a textbook. That is not project-based learning. You maybe did a project, a thing for a day, you built something, but that is not learning through projects. That is a dessert project. Most schools that claim to be doing project-based learning are dessert projects. The majority of the day looks like a standard, be quiet, memorize this type school, and then you get your photo op at the end of the year. One of the reasons, for those of you that follow us on Facebook, that we post a lot of learning on Facebook is to show, this isn't just the thing that we did after the STAR test that then we use all year to promote our school. That one day that you brought out the microscopes that then is on every banner in your school the entire year. We post a lot of content to show that this is what every day of learning looks like. That is project-based learning. We have shared a little bit about some other schools in the past, so I'm not going to go as deep into it this time, but some of you are new here, and so I do want to just touch on a few pieces. There's no other gathering place in the country. There's no other school operating at the gathering place in the country. There is not another model like ours. People ask us, did you replicate your model from another school? The answer is no. However, Asha and I were selected as one of the 20 most innovative school leaders in the country and went through a 2-year residency before we opened the gathering place, where we got to go visit some of the most innovative and best schools in the country. And we definitely learned a lot from them and pulled valuable bits and pieces from them. And so 3 that I want to just share quickly about. June Jordan School for Equity, based out of San Francisco. High Tech High, based out of San Diego. Iowa Big, for my little anticlimactic. June Jordan School for Equity. There we go. So this is a high school. And they are doing some of the best work around social justice in education. And their kids are leading the work. We got to speak to a group of students who put on a citywide summit discussing the challenges specifically that women face in roles of work and leadership in organizations, that the students organized themselves. The summit ended up drawing out over 5,000 people. They had a group of panelists, and then the mayor of San Francisco, finding out about this amazing summit, wanted to come speak, and they told them, no, this is about students, this is not about you, you're welcome to attend it. This was a student-driven summit to raise awareness about a conversation that many adults don't have spaces to talk about, and definitely kids rarely do. We were speaking to a kid in a panel, and the kid had to get up and leave. They were a sophomore in high school. And they said, I'm sorry, I have to go. I have to go to court. And we were like, oh, okay, so is everything okay? And they're like, oh yeah, I work with a law firm now that I got partnered with through my school. And I'm one of the main people that does background research on immigration cases to try and help support undocumented families that have been arrested through immigration customs officials, and I'm doing court. 15-year-old. High Tech High, there we go, weird clicker. High Tech High, definitely one of the most innovative project-based school networks in the country. They're based out of San Diego. One of the links here is to a website they have. They actually have a published book along with an entire website dedicated to showcasing student projects. One that was especially powerful, that actually ended up winning a White House Film Festival Award and a Latino Film Festival Award made by students at their school, was a documentary discussing gun violence. And it was an unbelievable documentary. One of the students at their school had been impacted by this. And so the kids ended up raising something like $30,000 on Kickstarter and ended up funding their entire documentary that then they published. And like, that's not what they did outside of school. That was school, right? That's the point. That's what we want kids to be doing in school. Iowa Big is a high school where there isn't even a school building. Kids instead, they have a partnership with the Department of Commerce for the city in Des Moines, and this school has nonprofits and business every year that submit their own projects using a project planning template that then mentors at the school partner students with, and students then spend a semester working on a project either with the city, a nonprofit, or business, and that's school. And something that we did not get to do years ago when we were talking about this that we can now is TGP gets a spot right along these leading schools around project-based learning. Our model of project-based learning has a specific approach, which is kids, the project cycle is about 8 weeks. Our first project showcase is November 17th. I'm sure that's on the calendars. Kids actually started their first full project this week. The first couple of weeks we do like a small project based on social emotional learning, then we go into our first full project cycle, where you pick a topic based on the interest of kids. At first, kids are exploring. This is making all those different connections. If you're focused on a singular idea, you begin exploring that idea in multiple ways. You get guest panelists to come out, maybe you go on a field trip, you read text about things, you watch video about things, you get to see multiple experiences about something. Then there's a pivot where in that area you define a problem. And that is like the central pivot to where then we go from exploring an idea, building background knowledge, I now have found the problem. Then you go through this messy creative process of how do I solve that problem. This is really the heart of a project cycle that then leads to some kind of showcase. And the showcase is not just to show off the brilliant work of our kids, although that is a part of it. The showcase is also helping kids understand that their work is worthy of other people's time and attention and ideas. 99% of the work that kids do in most schools ends up in the trash can after they finish. You get your grade back, you throw it away. Or maybe it gets sent home in a folder and it goes in a drawer. But like very rarely does the work of children in most schools get communicated to the world as something that matters. And that's not helpful. So we actually get to share about some of our own projects. We have done so many presentations where we're talking about other schools' project-based work. We now have this within our own catalog, which is beautiful. This was a project that Taylor and Colin's class did last year, where the problem they identified was that when people who are homeless, it started with just what is homelessness. There was like really good questions about it. Most schools you would say, we don't talk about that, go back to the workbook. Our kids dove into the conversation. One of the central problems they found was, when people are homeless, want to go to a shelter, but if they have pets, they can't because the shelters don't allow pets. So then this went into an entire architectural unit where kids created blueprints and designed floor plans for an animal shelter that could get added on to homeless shelters so that people who are homeless have a place for their pets while they're in the shelter. Anna Sandoval, who's Councilwoman 7, which is the council district that we're in here, then sent members of her team to come learn from our kids about the designs to add animal shelters to homeless shelters. Your work matters. Just because there's 7 or 8 doesn't mean that there isn't brilliance. But you just have to create space for it in a way that allows kids to make the connection to what they're doing in school matters in the world around. We have kids creating businesses. This is just absolutely beautiful. We had a group of kids last year that started making some of their own like fashion line. That they were like then hustling and selling because they knew how, which was fabulous. We had multiple caregivers call being like, "Is this?" My kids said they needed $2 to buy a purse from another kid at school. Is that real? We had an entire class put on a Hive market. This was new on Connie Renee's class last year, I believe, where each group of kids made different items, then learned how to create a business plan and sold those items to other caregivers at a showcase event that at the end of the year last year. Those are the kinds of skills that you learn in a project cycle. It's all real relevant work. They also then identified nonprofit organizations that they cared about, learned about them, and then all the proceeds went to the nonprofit organizations. We had kids build a chicken coop, learning how to work with drills and saws, and actually took care of chickens. It was one of the stranger starts to my day, because I was like walking past the room, and I heard a little like, and it's one of those moments where you kind of stop, and you're like, processing, did I just see what I heard? You don't turn around, you actually walk backwards. So you have to roll it back, and you like look in the room, and one of our teachers is just sort of standing like this, going, I hope this is okay. And we checked with our nurse, we checked with allergies. It was, so they just raised chickens in their classroom from it. The chickens were then donated somewhere safe, the chickens are okay, they're no longer on campus. The chickens are good. Really. There we go. This was a beautiful project. So many kids, this is kindergarten, this is Ms. Judy's class last year. So many kids suffered from isolation in the pandemic, but so did so many people in nursing homes. Our most medically fragile, basically just isolated in an area where they can't have visitors. And so Judy's class created a project-long partnership where each kid was assigned to a grant, and then they would read stories to them, they would learn stories from them, and document them, and this was an ending part of the project where they wrote cards to all of their grands that got mailed to them across different nursing homes across the city. Go back to that list, emotional intelligence is on there, right? So TGP, and this is a little bit of a look into the future. In the elementary school, projects are created by teachers. They are inspired by their kids, but the teacher plans the project. All kids are working towards the same outcome. Now they may be in different groups. The project about the pet design for the homeless shelters, each group had different designs, but they were all working on building a pet shelter that could go onto a homeless shelter. This is because that is what's developmentally appropriate at this age. In middle school, over the course of middle school, not at the beginning of next year, but over the course of middle school, it transitions to the students creating the projects. It's no longer one project that all kids are doing. We have shared this story before, I'll share it again. We went to a school in San Francisco, and as we were walking in, there was a group of kids also walking down the street of San Francisco. And this is like middle of downtown San Francisco, carrying a bunch of microwaves. We thought, this is odd. And then those same kids turned into the same school we were headed to, carrying a bunch of microwaves. They were 6th, 5th grade, maybe 10, 11, 12, carrying all these microwaves in. And we like sort of just like let them go about their thing. We were getting signed in, and then as we're taking a tour, we see the kids taking apart the microwave and wearing helmets. And now, I don't know how many of you have taken apart a microwave, but it's typically not an activity that has risk of concussion. So we were very curious why the helmets were attached. And the kids told us, oh yeah, our project is we are creating electromagnetic claws that will allow us to climb metal structures. And we're testing it today by climbing up the rafters, the metal rafters of our building. Oh, of course. Silly us. However, that was their project. Another kid in their class was doing a stop-motion animation of a story about a specific advocacy effort that she was working towards. Different kids designed their own projects based on their interests and passions, and teachers facilitate the learning through those projects. When you get to high school, It is no longer the teacher facilitating the learning. It is life. It is the world facilitating the learning. And teachers serving as a mentor as that's happening. The most classic example of this would be an internship. If you get placed in an internship, the teacher isn't with you all day, every day, being like, oh, don't do that. Oh, hold on, make sure you go over here. Wait, hold on. Remember, you gotta get this turned in. Like, you have the logical and natural consequences that come from good and bad decisions. You make a mistake, and the natural and logical consequences of that mistake guide your learning. That's how all of us live our lives, right? That is like navigating the world. And so the difference is the teacher is the mentor in this role as kids start to drift in and out of those internships, those different project opportunities. The teacher is the mentor guiding you through that experience. Now, high school is very far away. There's lots more details that will get developed over the next several years. But this is just to see the arc of where project-based learning is headed here at the Gathering Place. Final slide. I'm going to send this out on class tag. These are some really good resources in that 2-year residency that I told you about that Asha and I got selected for. One of our assigned mentor, who's a dear friend of ours, was also the keynote speaker at a national project-based learning conference that happens each year. So if you don't look at any of the other ones, definitely watch that one. Caleb, he's great. So anyway, that is a little bit about the research behind learning. We did neuroscience. We talked about educational theory. We took a deep dive into project-based learning across schools, both now and in the future. And so we will conclude by opening up for any questions, reflections, or anything people would like to share or ask. So the notes, just like how that teacher happens to think about your kid. However, the narrative gives you a lot more information, broken up in a lot more domains. Now, with that said, we do individualized reading assessments. So at this age, there is a skill set of reading. It is not measured well by multiple choice tests, but it is measured very well by one-on-one assessments. We have an entire dedicated employee whose name is an assessor. And all that she does all year is one-on-one assessment with kids. And what she's doing is she's gathering real data about where your child's at as a reader. And you will get that data. For those of you that have been here before, that's the M-class data. We do a beginning of the year. It's happening right now. We finished kinder. We're working in lower elementary. We'll be doing upper over the next few weeks. Then we do a middle of the year around January, February, and then the end of the year, obviously, at the end of the year. And so there, you get hard quantitative data, because the truth is, your child's ability to read is a major gate accessor to a lot of different things. And so you get better data than, say, an ELAR section of a STAR test, because it's an individualized assessment. And it's not stressful for kids. I would be surprised if anyone here has a kid that was like really stressed out from their in-class. They probably don't know what happened. They just got to read with somebody, right? But we're getting a lot of data. This year, we are doing something new that we have not done before. It's just a part of capacity building. This has always been sort of the long-term goal, but just building up capacity to do it, is we're using a numeracy assessment. It's the same effective assessment for kindergarten through 2nd grade. It's called the TEMA, the Test of Elementary Math Assessment. Yes, that's what it's called. That doesn't sound good. Anyways, and then the TOMA, which is the Test of Mathematical Ability. Test of Elementary Mathematical Ability and Test of Mathematical Ability are the names. It is the exact same thing. It is a one-on-one individualized assessment. Math cannot be assessed on the multiple choice test. If you are testing math on that, you're just testing if you remember. But we don't need to do that. We have calculators that just remembering how to stack numbers is not helpful. There was an amazing research piece where they had a bunch of elementary school math kids, and they asked them, what is 100 minus 99? This, if you have a conceptual understanding of numbers, should be very easy. 100 minus 99 is going to be 1, because 99 is 1 less than 100. But if you don't actually understand that, then all you have is an algorithm where you stack numbers. And trying to do 100 minus 99 with the algorithm is actually very hard, because you can't take 9 from 0, but you get taught to then borrow 1 from the other one, which doesn't make sense. You're not borrowing anything. That's not what borrowing is. But you take a 1 from another place value over here, but there's no 1 there because the 0 is in the tens place too. So then you have to borrow the 1 from the hundreds place, but if you don't conceptually understand it, you're actually not borrowing 1, it's now 10 tens but kids don't know that, and so over 75% of kids missed the question. And this was like third grade. Over 75% of kids missed the question, what's 100 minus 99? Because they were just trying to like remember the algorithm, instead of just stopping for a minute and being like, oh, it's what? And so that's why we don't do the multiple choice stuff. But we do an individualized one-on-one assessment of numeracy this year as well, so you'll be getting that on narratives as well when we do caregiver conferences, where someone's actually sitting down doing math with your child and assessing conceptual understanding. So you do get some key data around key skills, but then the areas where there just isn't a grade or assignable score, like social emotional skills, you get a educator's perspective on where your child is at. Yes?
So I think you're with the office open, right?
Yeah.